Yes, I'm Tracie Farrell. I work with Laura and Miri as part of our social data science group in KMI. I'm going to be talking to you today about two projects that I've been involved in our research group that focus on using a combination of social science modeling with computational techniques like natural language processing and machine learning technology to investigate potentially extremist language online. So basically, for this presentation, I'm just going to share with you some of the rationale that we have in looking at language to understand extremism. I'm going to talk you briefly through the two studies that we've done on the subject of the manosphere, which I'm going to describe a bit more in a moment, because of its features as a potentially radicalizing space for young men who've become disillusioned with society, and in particular, their relationships with women. We wanted to understand if we could apply some of the lessons learned in our other studies of extremism in other contexts like Miri presented about, and also because of its connection to a few high-profile crimes that occurred, the La Isla Vista terrorist attack and the Toronto van attack. In both cases, the perpetrator was a self-proclaimed member of groups operating in the manosphere. So I just want to highlight some of the methods and learning from each of these cases and then say a little bit about our future work. I always post this because I do have to mention some pretty rough vocabulary as I'm talking about this presentation. If it's not for you, I won't be insulted if you feel the need to leave or mute the presentation while we're talking about it. But before I start, I just want to say we tried to view the manosphere in our studies as a subcultural group or sub-society. And even though the word subculture has been debated a lot in the last 50 or 60 years, the theories of subculture offered something to our account about the shared values that subcultures express and the identity and values that they express through the way that they communicate. So in both of these studies, we were trying to understand more about those normative values for this subcultural community and how this shows through in the language that they use. For connecting the idea of language and culture, we know that language develops when we need it, when it makes us laugh, to enjoy ourselves, but also to respond to cultural hegemony. The way we speak communicates our presence to the outside world. It also names the unnamed and provides a new vocabulary for self-expression and identity markers within the community. So that's why it's important for us to have a look at the language that these groups, especially groups that we don't understand very well, to look at their language to understand more about what it is they're trying to say. And as an online space, if you're not familiar with it already, the manosphere is this loose network of communities that focus on men's issues. And they can be found on every platform. We looked at Reddit initially because this was the platform that was most often referenced in connection to the criminal activity that I mentioned before. But the manosphere is also on YouTube, it's on Gab, other social networking sites. And what you see there is very typical of other radicalizing spaces. There's a kernel of truth, a dissatisfaction and unfairness, and the collection of people in one place, which provides the sense of a movement or something larger than yourself, and a common enemy, in this case, women. The manosphere has a very specific language that's sometimes easy to spot. Even a few terms have made their way into the mainstream, like Chads or Stacy's, which you might have heard before for an attractive person. The next two slides, I just want to give you a sense for what's in the manosphere. The most obvious theme is about how feminism has ruined society. A lot of these discussions devolve into more personal experiences and misogynistic tropes like the unintelligent or hypersexualized, hypergamous woman whose only goal in life is to be taken care of with no effort. And a lot of times this goes back to personal experiences of divorce, family custody battles, in which sharing power with women can feel like a loss. So inside the manosphere, you have a lot of resentment toward women. And another particular area of focus, which might be interesting for policing community, is around false rape accusations, which are misconstrued as a pervasive social problem through the networked quality of the space. You know, we can talk about why that is, but it's definitely a common theme that you see in the manosphere. And why did we come to think of this as extreme? Well, there's connections of violence against women online to violence against women offline. But in this case, we also have the actual connection and self-identification with misogyny as the reason for committing crimes against women, as well as the public celebration and veneration of these crimes by other men in the manosphere. So the two case studies, in the first one, we're just trying to find out the quality of the language that's being used in this space in a more descriptive way. And in the second study, we were trying to build on that first study to look at emerging language, to see if we could pick apart the different flavors that exist in the manosphere in terms of the different groups involved, bringing us into the area of their actual ideologies and the different ideologies that exist. So just a bit about methodology. For study one, as I mentioned before, we are concerned about two things, volume and quality. I'm going to focus on the qualitative analysis here because that's my particular area as a social scientist, but luckily we have Dr. Miriam Fernandez. If you have any questions about the computational work, she was involved in this study as well. Study one was grounded on feminist models of misogyny at scale. So from the literature of feminist ideas of misogyny and what's included in all of that, we identified 9 key areas associated with misogyny, which you'll see in the next slide. And we took a selection of lots of different databases of hateful language, and we annotated each word or phrase to one of these 9 categories. And through this, we were able to build 9 different lexicons, which we then used natural language processing techniques to identify these terms and their categories across our data set, which you can see here is quite large, 6 million posts, 300,000 conversations from the different communities that we chose on Reddit. And we are observing this data over a longer period of time. I believe it's almost 7 years. So these are the 9 categories that we extracted from the literature and the terms that are represented by these categories, just some examples of that. Most of them are self-explanatory. The last 3 were created specifically from the literature around incel culture, which was the focus of our study. Stoicism is just the resignation of things as they are, called biological determinism and such. Patriarchy referring to the ordering of humans by status and power, where white men are at the top. And flipping the narrative is about turning the language of feminism in on itself, where men are actually the subjugated part of society. So what did we find? Well, the first set of findings are around what we learned about the network. Regarding participation in these groups, we could see that it was increasing, at least in terms of the numbers of authors contributing, so that's concerning. And second, we were able to see, which was very interesting, how groups move from one place to another after being blocked or quarantined through content moderation. I'm not sure if you can see the brown line at the far end of the graph, which starts and then quickly escalates and then quickly shuts down again. That's an example of a group that basically migrated from another quarantine group, and we're able to see that in the data, which is interesting. Second set of findings are around actually our categories and the types of language that we found distributed in the different communities. We found that we could see sexually violent and hostile rhetoric increasing. Unsurprisingly, we captured the largest peaks in what we had already qualitatively observed as our most hostile groups. And we also realized from this first study that these groups did have involving language conventions that even differed from group to group, and we wanted to understand more of how to understand this emergent language. And so that set up the motivation for the second study. So for the second study, we focused on methodologies for identifying, understanding the new terms. Miri spoke earlier about how extremist groups might invent new language to circumvent the kinds of approaches that we described previously. And so for this study, we used a computational technique called word embeddings. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but basically it allows you to see if a new word can be associated with any other word that you already do understand in the data. So word embeddings allow us to mathematically observe associations between words in any given text. If we were going to represent words in a dictionary, for example, we might see that the word bank is associated to the words finance and water, and understand that bank has potentially lots of meanings. So if you don't know the meaning of a word, you can use word embeddings to see what other terms it's associated with to better understand, and that's what we did in this study. We used the same data set from the previous study, only this time we identified the terms and the topics that are used in our specific data set. After filtering out the words that we already knew the meaning of and the words that were in the common usage, we arrived at 2,615 potential candidates of new terms or jargon in the manosphere. And then we used a combination of the literature and word embeddings to try and understand the meaning of those terms and to annotate them. So I'm just going to go briefly to this. Similar to the first study, we annotated these terms according to a set of categories that were derived from the literature. In this case, they were ideological categories. So we tried to go through the literature about these groups and the literature from within these groups, self-descriptions and self-representations. And we know that these groups have a conflict with hegemonic culture. That's the first example. So any word that included the concept of normativity, norm, normie, for example, we coded to this category. Conflicts with masculinity, just to give another example, are about the way that the men in these groups feel about other men and what it means to be a man. I'm not going to go through all of them here because of time, but you get a sense for what we're trying to achieve here. And of course, from these 2,600 plus terms, we had to exclude some terms because even though they're not found in a dictionary, they might be specific to Reddit or internet specific terms that weren't captured by our filtering process. So we had to remove those in the end as well. So findings from the second study. Well, first we were able to see the differentiation between groups and their ideologies, which was consistent with both the external representations and internal representations of these groups that we saw in the literature. You have incel groups, involuntarily celibate. They're primarily concerned with attractiveness and the various issues involved with that. That makes sense in consideration of their main complaint. Men going their own way is, interestingly enough, most concerned with the crisis of masculinity and hegemony. So they're the ones who are talking about, you know, feminist men as soy boys and this type of a thing. We were also able to see the level of shared ideology between different groups when we saw the categories converging within different groups through their shared language. And this helped us to surface more nuances in the categories. For example, discussions about race and ethnicity within the subcommunities inside the manosphere. So what this work illuminated for me was that it's possible to identify some of the same important features computationally that you can using more traditional qualitative methods. You can determine which groups might be connected through the direction of their relationships. That's not something we looked at in these two studies, but we can see which groups develop the most new terms, which also says something about the needs of this group to find language that fit their perceptions of the world. So with a bit more knowledge, it's possible to tease out the different ideological positions, and what previously looked like a monolith of subcultures actually broken down into lots of other subcultural features. One thing I just want to highlight here that was particularly present in our second study was the issue of intersectionality in these groups. In addition to finding fault with women, whiteness is also critiqued from a deterministic standpoint, as well as class. And in some way, these groups are having the same kinds of discussions as feminists have, only their point of view is that these things are sort of immovable facts of society rather than something that you can work on and shift. And this means that the situation is really perceived as hopeless, especially for poor men of color in our sample. That's something worth exploring further. On the flip side of that, we're also concerned with what this means for the women of color that these men interact with. We saw lots of statements about women of color being race traitors, for example, as well as all of the other typical accusations being leveled toward white women. And at the moment, one of our PhD students is looking into the subject of misogynoir online, which is a specific brand of misogyny coupled with racism that is experienced by women of color. Oops. I previously had another slide which was just talking about a little bit about the limitations of this study, so I'm just going to mention that shortly. Obviously, this work is developed from existing data sets on the Reddit platform. It'd be interesting to plot these terms across other different platforms and compare community representations across them. And in addition, our pipeline for identifying new terms, it generated some noise as well as identifying the best candidates. So we're looking more intensively at this process and how it can be improved. And in addition, this work doesn't address existing words that are given new meanings, which is another type of language innovation. Having a way of identifying those, potentially through word embeddings, may add to this type of research. So now let me just see if I have another slide here. Yep, so that's all I have for you. I'm really looking forward to some questions or comments on this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tracie. Again, fascinating, and it's interesting to see how it potentially connects with some of the earlier speakers as well in terms of their areas of research. We are literally sort of down to a minute. Are there any questions from people that they want to pop into the chat? If not, then I've got one or two. Just then for Miriam, I'm curious. I know policing in particular has struggled sometimes to get an active engagement with social media companies. Are you getting sort of a sense of passive or active support from the social media companies, or more of a sense of defensiveness around having conversations?
I mean, it depends on the type of social media. For example, Twitter is very open to share data with researchers. They have been hiring quite a lot of social scientists lately as well to try to understand these problems. I mean, other social media platforms are completely against content moderation or blocking users. So it just depends really on the platform that you are talking about. But I mean, there is also a lot of government regulation that is going on at the moment as well. So I don't know if you have seen, the European Union has released the new regulations on AI that also include, some guidelines on how to block some of these accounts and so on. But of course, there is a very thin line as well that should be considered between blocking these accounts and freedom of speech, which is something that, communities and activists are highlighting as something that we should be very careful, because some governments might use, these issues of saying like, okay, this is online harm, this is, extremist content, this is misinformation, to just block accounts that are actually from activists that are trying to defend a position. So there is a very thin line that we all need to, walk in here together, because I mean, my personal belief is that we need all of us, from our different perspectives and views, to contribute to this problem. Because if you take only one angle, you always miss something important. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious that we are now into the lunch break, so if people do want to leave, that's fine. But if the speakers are okay with just staying for another couple of minutes, there is another question in the chat, and I think it'd be useful. For those of you who do want to leave, we're back at 1 o'clock in the main room for a plenary with Dr. Paul Wally from the Open University. So thank you for those that do need to disappear. There's a question in the chat, which I guess covers perhaps Miriam and probably Tracie's area, about crossover into extreme right-wing groups, and whether you're seeing that. Perhaps Tracie, you want to pick up on that?
I do. I mean, at the moment it's qualitative, and we've discussed it in our research team about how to actually study this issue, but there's a lot of crossover for groups like Men Going Their Own Way and a libertarian point of view, so anti-government in general or anti-big government. I'd be really curious about the professions, actually, that, a lot of the men that I saw are working in male-dominated fields, and can be some related crossover with right extremist groups in that sense as well. So yes, that's definitely something we want to investigate in the future.
I guess the thing there is also it's the balance, as Miriam was saying, around free speech versus actually people moving over into criminality, planning or actually undertaking, actions against people, and it's that balance. Is there any sense that what you're looking at would give a predictive capacity in terms of people's predilection to actually turn what might just be an offensive conversation into actually an action in the real world?
I'm not sure in my case if it's always even intentional. I think it's the qualities of having a large group of people with a shared gripe about society collecting in an online space. It's different from the physical world where you might meet 1 or 2 people that have the same opinion of you, and you kind of get the sense that your viewpoint might be extreme. But if you've got 1,000 or 20,000 people all collecting in the same space, it gives you this idea that this is a socially acceptable point of view. And that's our concern with extremism in the manosphere, is that this could have the potential to radicalize people to more extreme views about women and think they're acceptable, even as an unintentional consequence.
And I guess just again, conscious of the time, it's a shame because I think we could spend a lot more time on this. Lara, are particularly interested in the secrecy aspect of the chatbot and the potential ethical issues around that, because obviously if a child disclosed abuse to a professional, there would be a degree of promising to retain some degree of confidentiality, but when you get to law breaking, it does have to be reported, and any teacher or medical professional knows that. Just curious about whether you consider those ethical issues and the conclusions you came to.
Well, I think, when we go to develop that, indeed, everything has to be reviewed in that sense of safeguarding and how to deal with this critical, really, when you have to take an action about that. But from the children's perspective, they don't want anything to be shared or stored. They just want to understand and have a guidance on what to do next, and that's it, and then delete.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Very difficult.
It is, yeah.
Thank you ever so much to all three of the speakers. Really informative, and as I said, I think we could have spent a lot longer. As I said, 1 o'clock we're back in the main room, so thank you very much for everybody being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks, bye.